Hello and welcome to the Hell Project. This is where we discuss everything about hell. You might have noticed a lack of videos over the last couple of weeks. I've been starting up a new channel called Critical Witness. Feel free to search for it. I'll put a link into the description of the video. It's a bit of a broader topic, kind of conversation with a friend of mine, and more topics around apologetics, evangelism, the church from a UK perspective. If that interests you, long-form conversations, kind of like this one that we're going to have with Darren, then feel free to head on over and subscribe to that channel. Before I continue, I've been having a bit of issues with sound levels, so I'm going to bring Darren into view. Hi, Darren. You are now live.
Hello.
I'm going to on death. Let's put me on the screen now. So, conditionalists emphasize life. Annihilationists emphasize the destruction after death. So you die and it's death. Some annihilationists might recognize judgment as well. Well, what else have we? I mean, we've talked talked around the houses. The backstory of Matthew, talking about destruction meaning an end so far. We're going to talk about destruction in a moment in this conversation. And then just emphasizing that throughout this sermon, Jesus keeps referring back to Psalm 37. And Psalm 37 is all about inheriting the land. And the opposite of inheriting the land is being cut off and being end. Chaff is an image from Psalm 37. It's also an image used in Matthew 3. And every time destruction and judgment is used, it is to denote a destruction, an end. So we're both convinced that Matthew so far is teaching an end. We've talked a lot about it. I've had to cut probably quite a bit of our conversation due to a horrid echo. But now we're back on track. I have read Matthew 7. I read Matthew 7, so the echo shouldn't be there. But do you want to then go on to having just finished Matthew 7:14, for the gate is narrow and the way is hard that leads to life, and those who find it are few. Do you want to crack on from there?
Well, let's start with this idea that I'll throw this out there. I'll posit the idea that 13 and 14, Matthew 17, 13, 14, is a kind of a summary of Psalms 37. So just like Psalms 37 is saying, look, here's abundant life of the inherit the land, you live forever, it's abundant life. As opposed to the everyone else, the unrighteous who pass away, are cut off, utterly destroyed. There's a whole lot of language that he uses. You're like smoke that's just ephemeral, it just goes. The fields that pass away. So this is like a summary. So that's what you're being deprived of. So when we look at this word destruction, we have to keep that in mind, that it's not just being snuffed out of existence, but it's an act by which someone is deprived of that life, and that's what makes this particularly a conditionalist text and not just an annihilationist text. Though we are annihilationists, annihilationism is a subset or is a part of conditionalism. But of course, the question in the hell debate is, what does the word destruction mean? Well, in this case, it's apolumi. What does it mean? And if we just were to say, if I was just to get on Facebook and in the various groups I'm in, and just say destruction means they're destroyed, I'll get a lot of pushback, because they'll say, but you're begging the question. All right. And so what I wanted to do was address that particular objection, because if we keep in mind that Psalms 37 is the background, that will take away or address a lot of that. It'll take a lot of air out of that argument that we get from traditionalists. And the way I wanted to do that was to actually first start with three conditionalists that actually cite or talk about destruction and link it somehow to Matthew 7, and then look at a response from, say, D.A. Carson. D.A. Carson wrote a book, 1996, called The Gagging of God, and he addressed a bit of for him the current or contemporary annihilationist arguments from people like John Stott. And so his argument there is often cited by, it's kind of formed the basis for pretty much every other traditionalist after him, who will usually just say word for word what Carson said here. So you got a good bet if we can deal with this now, we're probably going to deal with just about any articles thrown at you that is saying the same thing, because they're all just going to be repeating. They don't advance the argument, they just repeat what Carson says. Anyway, I'm going to get into John Stott. This is from the Rethinking Hell book. We included John Stott's essay from his book Essentials, where he talked about judgment and hell, and he admitted that he was a tentative annihilationist. I'm going to read that out, the bit that he argues and that Carson will respond to. Then I'm going to go to two other annihilationists or conditionalists. So this is John Stott. The vocabulary of destruction is often used in relation to the final state of perdition. The commonest Greek words are the verb apolumi, which means to destroy, and the noun apoleia, which means destruction. When the verb is active and transitive, destroy means kill, as when Herod wanted to murder the baby Jesus, and the Jewish leaders later plotted to have him executed. So we've discussed this. So listeners who listened to our first podcast would have been familiar with this argument from us. Then Jesus, so I'm back on the start. Then Jesus himself told us not to be afraid of those who can kill the body and cannot kill the soul. That's Matthew 10:28, which we are going to come to in a future broadcast. And Stott continues, if to kill is to deprive the body of life, hell would seem to be the deprivation of both physical and spiritual life, that is an extinction of being. When the verb is in the middle and intransitive, it means to be destroyed and so to perish, whether physically of hunger or snakebite, or eternality in hell, and so forth. If believers are those who are being saved, unbelievers are those who are perishing. The phrase occurs, he'll go on to a little bit to just get into the Pauline use of the language. And then where are we? Yeah, and then he gets to Matthew 7:13. Sorry, I lost it. Jesus also recorded in the Sermon on the Mount, is also recorded in the Sermon on the Mount as contrasting, note that word contrasting, the narrow road that leads to life and the broad road that leads to destruction. It would seem strange, therefore, if people who are said to suffer destruction are in fact not destroyed. And as you put it, that's the man Edwards. Edwards was a guy, was a moderate liberal that in Essentials, they were talking about essential doctrines. So as you put it, it is difficult to imagine a perpetually inconclusive process of perishing. So this last sentence is what Carson hones in on. It would seem strange, therefore, if people are said to suffer destruction are in fact not destroyed. It is difficult to imagine them being their destruction being a perpetual process of perishing. That's a tongue twister.
That's a proper tongue twister. Right. Well done for handling that one.
Sorry about that. It actually was harder to read out than I thought. But that's that idea. I think that John Stott had gone through a lot of biblical background to be able to say that and draw that conclusion. But he does. He actually says, well, this is what destroy is. It's to end you. So it'd be funny and weird if the Bible really didn't mean it ends you. So John Wenham was a lot in a separate essay, but you can find it in the Rethinking Hell book.
I've actually managed to put it onto the screen
succinct
for people just so that they can see what you're reading. So beautiful. Keep going.
Yeah. Okay, so they can see where I'm butchering it as I'm reading it. Our Lord himself in the Sermon on the Mount uses destruction, which he contrasts with life and the destination of those who choose the broad road. So you'll notice here what I'm doing. I'm not just pulling these comments out just because they mention destruction, but because they're noting the contrast between you have life and destruction, which is the opposite of that, or the contrast of that isn't utter life; it's non-life. Yeah, it's not life; it's destruction. Glenn Peoples, who is part of Rethinking Hell, and you'll see his essay, Introduction to Evangelical Conditionalism, he goes to Matthew 7 as well. But I want to read what he says as well. Evangelical conditionalists observe that Scripture uses a range of language and images to refer to the fate of humanity without salvation through Christ. Punishment, darkness, fire, death, destruction, being blotted out, and so on. Without any doubt, however, the overwhelming preponderance of the clearest such language speaks of the final death and destruction of the enemies of God. Just before I move on, doesn't that kind of sound like what Psalms 37 is getting at?
Yeah, definitely.
You know, there's probably different images used, but there's a range of them to emphasize the end, the true death of those who don't inherit the land. I'm back on the Glen. Jesus told his disciples that rather than fearing men who can kill the body, they should be afraid of the one, excuse me, who can destroy both the body and soul in hell. There is no doubt as to what it means for men to kill the body. Here, God's power to kill the whole person in Gehenna is affirmed by Jesus, but it is no isolated proof text. The fact is stressed often and emphatically in Scripture. A small sample is enough to make the point. In Matthew 7:13 to 14, the Lord warns that we should seek the narrow path that leads to life, and that the way to destruction, by contrast, is wide and followed by many. I'll just cut that off there. Why I brought those broader quotations from those conditioners out there is because they are setting it against more broadly biblical data, and so that alone would tell you that we're not just begging the question, but still we do get that response from people like Carson. So I'm going to read Carson's response here. Now, this is aimed at Stott's argument I read before. So here we go. This argument is too hasty. The Aquileia word group has a range of meanings depending on the context. It can refer to the lost coin or lost son of Luke 15 and to the ruined wineskin of Matthew 9:17. In neither case is cessation of existence in view. Similarly, the ointment lavishly poured out on Jesus in the mind of his disciples is a waste. The same noun is deployed with no suggestion that the ointment goes out of existence. Moreover, when life and destruction are contrasted, as in John 3:16, one might reasonably infer that destruction refers to the cessation of existence only if life means no more than mere existence. But is Christ doing no more than contrasting mere survival and extinction? Rather, Christ is contrasting two qualitatively different types of existence, one involving a loving communion with God and another lacking it, i.e. a state of ruin. Stott's conclusion is memorable but useless as an argument because it is merely tautologicalist. I cannot say that word.
I'm not
It's
going to
on
give
the
it a go.
screen, you can all read it. Of course, those who suffer destruction are destroyed, but it does not follow that those who suffer destruction cease to exist. Stott has assumed his definition of destruction in his epigraph. So there's the basis there of the accusation that we question back when we say destruction means destruction, because they'll say it could mean something else. It doesn't mean non-existence. You'll note there that he before I get to that, he says this. I want to focus on this. Okay, so One aspect of Carson's argument has to do with the assumption that if eternal life has a qualitative aspect, then so also the destruction of unbelievers must have a qualitative aspect. That's actually his assumption. Yeah. And I want to challenge that. So when he says when life and destruction are contrasted, one might reasonably infer that, so I guess it's not an assumption, he's inferring it, that destruction refers to one might reasonably infer that destruction refers to cessation of existence only if life means no more than existence. But this is the question in my mind. Does it follow that just because life could be said to be abundant life, so it has a qualitative aspect or dimension, does it mean just because life has that, that therefore death also must have that? That's what I want
Yeah.
to challenge. Because I think what he's saying is that, well, life has, therefore, so for death has a qualitative aspect. Therefore, John Stott was
Yeah.
wrong. That's what I'm thinking.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on that before I launch into Psalm 37 to show how wrong
Yeah,
Carson
I
is?
think there's an element of what is this jumping to cessation of existence? I,
Yes.
I'm not quite put my finger on the issue,
Okay.
so I'm looking forward to your response. I
Yeah.
can feel there's an issue. It's one of those things that I haven't quite articulated it. I don't. Partly it's because I don't empathise with the argument. I don't. I don't see. I guess I challenge their view of what existence even means. Because the language of the
Yeah.
Bible is very much one of the wicked will become corpse or an ash or on an ash. They will become ash or chaff on the
Yeah.
wind. So the idea is that the wicked will become something that's animate and alive to something that's
Yeah.
inanimate and can be called an object. From a
Yeah.
human experiential perspective, that's ceasing to exist. That is what my definition of ceasing to exist is. Existence as a human is being able to question my existence, is being able to be sentient, is being able to make decisions, it's being able to breathe, have the spirit of God in
Yeah.
me. There's all of those elements that encompass a broad spectrum of life, and in this life, there are those who qualify for life despite not necessarily having the full function of their bodies, but they are still living. That you would not call them a
Yeah.
corpse until they are not living. And so you have this idea then
Yeah.
in Isaiah 66:24 is the one where I'm pulling out for the idea of a corpse. Well, if that's the judgment on the wicked is that they become a corpse, well, they are no longer existing in functional terminology, as in the terminology that we use every day. that so
Yeah.
when someone jumps to this argument, and I've seen people do it just off the cuff, death doesn't mean non-existence. Well, yeah, it kind of does. So that's my issue, and so maybe that's my less philosophical response. But I think it's an important one. Is that we see life as an engagement and experience of everything around us. That we are animate. That we have our being
Yeah.
in God. We move. We live. We have our being.
Yeah.
So I think that I do find it interesting that the tautology or tautologousness of Stott's argument
I'm not the only one that
uh,
can't say it.
is actually cuts back to Carson quite quickly, um,
Yeah.
because it's an
Yeah.
assumed
Well,
definition.
that's what I would have. Yeah. I mean, in the end, I think it's a sword that cuts both
Mm.
ways. And I'll show that. Um, because he's often assuming certain meanings of his own proof. The word he's assuming the meaning of destruction within his own
Hmm.
proof texts, and quite clearly in the face of the evidence that within
Yeah.
those contexts, and he's leading others to it. But as to your question of why they want to reframe our view as say it's the view of non-existence is the opposite of getting eternal life. I think that's a rhetorical or a debate tactic. Whether that's intentional or not, I'm not always sure. But if we can say like the penalty, the eternal punishment is capital punishment. It's the execution, and execution is about what you're being deprived of, as much as about
Yeah.
what's actually directly being done to you. So when you're killed, it's taking away all of that life like ours that they
Hmm.
might have. That's actually a really good philosophical basis for against. I mean, the idea of abortion is that like objectively, it's abortion is wrong because it robs the unborn person a
Yeah.
life like ours. I mean, that's yeah, um, and the difference here is that with capital punishment, it's a just action. It's part of a juridical or legal sentence and punishment on people who have
Hmm.
actually done wrong. So, but it's for the same reason. It's
Yeah.
serious. But when you want to say snuffed out of existence, you rob that completely, and it becomes like you actually don't have a very significant view of punishment. Well, it's not even a punishment, is it, if you just
That's right.
blipped out
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
existence? And so they
Yeah.
smuggle all that in and say, look, we have something very significant, very weighty. They're punished
Hmm.
forever. Look how weighty that is. Look what you believe in. It's
Yeah.
just snuffing out. So there's the straw man. It's setting up the weaker view
Yeah.
of the other side and comparing it to your strong view. That's not at all why we think that it's
Hmm.
important that they actually go out of existence. We think they do, but that's not what we think is primarily so horrendous with it. It's the taking away of that
Yeah.
abundant life. And you go back to Psalms, right? So Psalm 37. Just note here that what I had honed in on with Carson was this idea that a qualitative life, if you're contrasting life and death, his contention is if the life has a abundant quality to it, then so also the death must have some kind of quality to it as well. Well, I was looking around and thinking in the Old Testament or the New Testament, where can I find an example where that is just not true? And hey, Psalm
That'll do
37.
it.
It's actually is that very
Mm.
text, and Jesus is drawing on that. So who would have thunk it? Jesus did. Um, so, like all the way through, and I've only picked here and highlighted our aspect or parts of Psalm 37, 9 to 10. I want people to listen to this, and when he contrasts the life and the life of the wicked and the end of the evildoers. So, Psalm 37, 9
Oh,
to 10. For evildoers shall be cut off, but those who wait for the Lord shall inherit the land. In just a little while, the wicked will be no more. Though you look carefully at his place, he will not be there. But the meek shall inherit the land and delight themselves in abundant peace. Look at that. You don't have this idea of the psalmist isn't operating on this principle of there's abundant life for the righteous, therefore the end of the wicket must also have some quality of life too. They're gone. Like how more explicit do you need that to be?
it's interesting that you've got
18,
the
19,
meek in
20.
there as well,
Yeah,
just to highlight that. So going back for the
yeah,
context, because we've probably cut out most of our context from the sound issues. That the meek is what
yeah.
Jesus uses uh, in
5, 5.
5:5. Yeah. So this is the language
Mm-hmm.
of the Sermon on the Mount being used in Psalm 37,
Yep,
or Jesus
yep,
using Psalm 37. So that's really important just to highlight the
yep.
context here. We've seen the meek. That's exactly the language that Jesus has used, and why we go back to Psalm 37.
This is Jesus' own background text that he alluded to, cited, that he's been operating. It's the context, and it runs directly against what Carson had just argued. There's more. The Lord knows that this is 18, 19, 20. The Lord knows the days of the blameless and their heritage will remain forever. They are not put to shame in evil times. In the days of the famine, they have abundance. but the wicked will perish. And the enemies of the Lord are like the glory of the pastures. They vanish like smoke. They vanish away. So that'll keep going. You've got in 28, 29, you've got, sure, the righteous are preserved forever. The children of the wicked shall be cut off. The righteous shall inherit the land and dwell on it forever. 34, 35, 36, you've got, he will exalt you to inherit the land. You will look on when the wicked are cut off. But he passed away, and behold, there was no more. Though I sought him, he could not be found. So again, that's the idea that you're looking for these people in the land. They're just not there. They're gone. 37, 38. For there's a future of the man of peace, but transgressors shall be altogether destroyed. The future of the wicked shall be cut off. So you've got all of this language in the Psalms, like cut off, being no more, will perish, vanish like smoke, pass away, not be found. They're gone. They're altogether destroyed. There is no sense of a qualitative
future.
A kind of death where they have a really terrible quality of life, that they're not in a state of perpetual ruination. They're gone.
Yeah. There's no future.
So this idea that just because you think, on the one hand, there's abundant life, does not mean that the destruction of the wicked must mean or has to do with living in a perpetual state of ruin. I think that's pretty much that pretty much addresses Carson's argument, that particular argument. So what do you think about that? I'd like to get your thoughts, Philip.
Just to emphasise the last bit that you read, though, there's no future. There's how conclusive can you get? I mean, that's not just about the life. Because if you go on calm.org, Matt Slick's got his huge amount of articles. I mean, he's gone for quantity, not quality, unfortunately, in his arguments. And he says Psalm 37. He goes verse by verse and tries to cut out bits that are about this life, bits that are about that life, and completely misses the way that you generally interpret every other psalm that he would interpret if it is all about the future. It's both. There's an aspect here that the psalmist is saying, can you cut them off now? But actually you're going to do it in the future. I'm going to look for that time where the wicked will be no more, and they will have no future. I can't get past that now. That I couldn't. I don't think I could come back to ECT even if I tried, because as I said before, the language is so blatant that there is no future. It's not even just there's some quality there. It's gone. So I do have a couple comments along these lines, but they do echo kind of the stuff that you're going to be coming up with. So I'm not going to spend too much time doing that, because I think otherwise we'll miss out on some of your arguments and go on for hours, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But I'll probably save my comments for a little bit further on as you bring up, especially because they're to do with ruination and the kind of, I want to see you develop Carson's comments further before I make comment.
So what I think goes on in, like, as a traditionalist myself, and I think that goes on, I could say this was true for me, but what I think goes on for a lot of traditionalists is that there is that assumption that that assumption, because as A, therefore exactly B. So as you see ongoing life with A, and if it's abundant life for them, well, there's got to be abundant ruination for everyone else. And I think that's back to that problem of question begging, but I think it's on their side of the ledger, not ours. And because we can look at a psalm like 37, we can no longer buy that. Yeah. So if we can no longer buy into that assumption, then we're like, well, I can't go back to ECT using that route. And that's what you're kind of saying. I feel like I can't go back to ECT now because I can no longer buy that footing for that argument. Because this is a foundational argument for everything else that he says. So once you take that away, then everything else seems to fall away much more easily. See? if we just focus on the language of destruction, they're still going to have that underlying assumption going, and that's why I addressed it first. And I'm really grateful to Carson for actually stating it, because it gives you something something tangible to work with. But moving on, I did want to actually address some of his other arguments there. I'm catching up with my notes now, and I'll just read what I got here. My second point is that Carson and other traditionalists framed the discussion with the idea of hard annihilationism in mind and non-existence also in mind, and use that to argue that the biblical language of destruction does not support the conditionalist reading of texts like Matthew 7:13 to 14. What I'm going along these lines sounds similar, but it's not. There's with hard annihilationism, I mean this idea that your every part of every molecule of your being is blinked out of existence, and the idea, obliterated. I'll invent words. I'm Australian. I'm allowed to. Australia. The idea of non-existence isn't so bad for us, but what they do is they want to make out they want to frame the debate as if we are arguing that the word death or destruction means to be rendered non-existence, which isn't what we argue. Some annihilationists might argue that with respect to Apollumi or something like that, but we don't, like at Rethinking Hell. It's more about deprivation of life. So there's a lot of forms of destruction that kill you. Yeah. It doesn't mean that in any of that the words themselves, destruction and death, should be defined as being rendered non-existent or to have your molecules obliterated. Even though we think logically it leads to that. And remember back in Matthew 2, where our first session, we were talking about death. We actually addressed this question of how dying logically leads to not being there anymore.
Yeah.
And that just is reflected in language there, where you've got in Matthew 2, they're talking about using the words death, and then also that they are no more. It doesn't mean that being no more is a part of the definition of the word death itself. So I think that when traditionalists try to smuggle that into the definition, try to transform the debate or the conditionalist debate into one about the language of destruction means to cease to exist, I think they're trying to move the debate to a point where they can more easily rebut it. But in their own, as what I wanted to do today is work through some of his own examples, Carson's own examples of destruction, and show how they in fact come back and support, they actually provide better support for the conditionalist point of view. So where are we? I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. Okay. I'm going to go right down to, okay, so the examples that they give us like a lost coin. I missed the lost what is it? The parable of the recalcitrant son, the son that when he was lost too. I missed that in my analysis here, but I can come back to it another day, another time. The lost coin, the wasted ointment of Matthew.
Yep.
Yeah, the ruined wineskin, desolated land, the destruction of the inhabited world through a flood. These are all examples biblical examples that Carson and then Douglas Moo will bring up, and they're followed by the likes of Greg Koukl from Stand to Reason. And then they'll use other examples like a destroyed house or cancer killing a patient or bad news destroying a vacation.
Don't forget that the car wreck as well is quite a common one. I've destroyed my car. It still means there's a frame there.
I've totaled it. Yeah. Well, it's the same idea as a destroyed house. They'll cite all those examples and they'll say, look, that doesn't mean that thing that's destroyed or that person who's gone out of existence, and we'll go, yeah, we know, but it'll kill them. Like, okay.
That's
So
exactly.
obviously the debate for them is in a slightly different place than the debate is for us, and it's really hard to shift them over to what we're trying to say. So that's why I always try to use their examples and show how they, and trying to illustrate, I guess, how it supports conditionalism.
But
so that's what I'm going to do now.
And I think you might get to it a little bit in the text, but it's such a category error to bring an example of a wineskin to an example of a human, and they're different. The wineskin doesn't experience its ruination, so even in that sense, even if it is ruination, the thing that's under ruination isn't alive, isn't experiencing it. And it's the same with the car wreck. It's the same with the house. It's the same with all of them. The only ones that you can, the destruction of the inhabited world through the flood. Well, they're dead. That ruination killed them. It's the dead. Examples that are brought up as the idea, and even a desolated land from Ezekiel, which you'll discuss a little bit. We're talking about death of vegetation, death of everything that allows us to live, and so I just find these examples actually quite amusing if they weren't so misused. Like, it's really hard to not laugh it off. And go, is that really your argument?
That's kind of let the cat out of the bag there. But I wanted to go through and discuss each example with a little bit of depth and try and show why we would just find that. There?
I'm sorry.
Utterly
really, we do need to go through it seriously. But I also, I wrote an article out of frustration on our website, 10 traditionalist arguments that need to die, literally quoting verbatim from a specific argument on a Facebook thread, because we're doing the hard work. And I just don't see it in the traditionalist camp, but I see the same arguments just thrown out there. Oh, look at the wineskin! Look at the car wreck!
When did Carson write this? 1996. What century are we in?
It's 2020. Come on.
So 24 years, and this argument is still being trotted out. Undeveloped,
and it's a terrible argument.
Not Tim Barnett and Greg Kugel did use it as a broader. They did develop some new, fresh kind of direction, and in a lot of ways, but they didn't really develop this argument.
No. I haven't seen anyone get over category error. No one has convinced me that I should consider a wineskin's ruination the same as a person's ruination under judgment. Not one person has done that. So
no. Well, you put the you hit the nail right on the head with a hammer there before when you said that most of these examples that they have don't have to do with sentient beings. They're like a house. They're inanimate objects. And what you might look at and you go, okay. You might look at a piece of wood and you can look at that and say, oh, it's destroyed. That is quite a different thing than to say that someone who is flesh and blood, has brain cells that have come together with electrical activity, and they've got thoughts, they've got human experience. Even an animal that doesn't quite have the sentient nature that we have. Or the ability to think as we do, death is the destruction of an animal is somewhat different to the destruction of wood, and we treat it differently. Nobody's going to take you to jail or fine you for chopping down a tree,
or bursting a wineskin,
unless it's some kind of rare tree, or if it's a piece of wood on the ground. If you just light it, they're not going to do that. But if you go and butcher a cat. And there's clearly pain involved with that, you are going to be fine, because we do make this distinction between a piece of wood on the one hand and a living being like a cat or a dog on the other hand, and we do attach some. We see they are a different category. Yeah, well, a human is a whole
Hmm.
different thing again because of our experiences, because of our life. And if we have um, the biblical view of what a human is and what life is with God, taking that away is a whole
Hmm.
different ballgame again. When you destroy the person, so when you talk about category
Yeah.
area, yeah, I agree. And but notice most of the examples have to do with what
Yeah.
inanimate
Well,
objects,
all of them do. I think
except for
Chris
that last
Tate definitely
one.
argues that every time a polymer is used towards a human or an agent
Yeah,
destroying a human,
yeah,
it is to do with death
yeah,
and killing.
yeah. Yeah, that
Yeah.
we'll
Oh,
get to that
sorry. I
in
keep jumping
1028.
ahead.
We yeah, that's all right. But we will. So I don't want to go over it too much there. Here, I want to
Mm.
unpack maybe some of our responses to these specific arguments. So the wineskins, that it does appear in other of synoptics, like
Hmm.
I think in Luke, but it in Matthew 9:17, Jesus talks about old wineskins, and you don't put new wine in old wineskins because they'll burst. And I've known this for a while, but I want to point this out again. I
We'll
pointed
probably
it out
point it out
before.
when we get to
It
Matthew
seems to
9.
just go over people's heads. Yeah. Uh, um, that word burst, when it's used in the passive voice as it is in 9:17, it carries this idea of being torn to pieces, and it's used by Matthew in Matthew
Mm.
7:6 when you've got dogs pulling something apart. But it's the idea of shredding. It's not just this tiny little hole and, oh, you've ruined it, and it's just sitting there in a state of ruin. The thing is obliterated. It's
Yep.
like, yeah, it's like a balloon. You blow it up, and it pops. Like
That's really
that
interesting
done to
that
the
it's
wineskin.
connected.
It's
It's
destroyed. It's shredded. Now, if you do that to a human, what do you think is
Yeah.
going to happen?
It's interesting you've connected that
It's going to
to
kill them.
verse 6. Do not give what is holy to dogs or throw your pearls before pigs, otherwise they will trample them under their feet and turn around and tear you to pieces. The burst is similar there, is it?
Yeah, it's the same word and used in the passive. Yeah, yeah. I didn't bother to follow
Oh,
that
it
through
is.
because all I
Yeah,
want to say
that's
here,
amazing. So yeah, I can see that in
yeah,
Greek. I've never connected that before. That's
you rip
huge.
it to pieces. Yeah. Well, tradition's connected. I mean, I got this from
Oh
Leon
right, okay.
Morris. So, but he just
I've just
doesn't
not
follow it
not heard
through.
that one before.
So,
That's fine. Cool. Keep going.
yeah. Oh, that's fine. But what we're saying is that if the wineskin kind of represents a kind of destruction that they want to emphasize, then it actually only helps us because if what happens to the wineskin with that ruin, that kind of
Mm.
ruin, that bursting, shredding, whatever, happens to a human, if it happens to the body and the soul,
It's all over.
1028, maybe 1028, then it's all over. It kills them. All right, that's all
Yeah,
we need to
yeah,
show. So that example, I think, is actually very good. Is better for us
yeah.
than it is for them.
Yeah, I'd agree with you on that one. Yeah,
Yeah,
this is why I love this. I
destroyed
keep
land.
going away with, oh man, that's another thing. So yeah, no, that's huge.
Yeah,
Good.
yeah. There's destroyed land. Traditions will cite Ezekiel 6:14, and there's one or two other examples from Ezekiel where they'll say, "Look, the land is destroyed, but it's not gone out of existence." So there we go. This kind of state of ruin. Okay, I'll read Ezekiel 6:11 to 14, so you get the context here. Thus says the Lord God: clap your hands and stamp your foot and say, Alas, because of all the evil abominations of the house of Israel, for they shall fall by the sword, by famine and pestilence. He who is far off shall die of pestilence, and he who is near shall fall by the sword, and he who is left is preserved and shall die of famine. Thus I will send my fury upon them, and you shall know that I am the Lord. And when their slain lie among their idols, around their altars, on every high hill, on all the mountain tops, under every green tree, under every leafy oak, wherever they offered a pleasing aroma to all their idols, I will stretch out my hand against them and make the land desolate and waste, and all their dwelling places from the wilderness of Riblah. Then they will know that I'm the Lord. The really key thing I want everyone to note here is that part of uh, the desolation of making the land desolate or destroying the land is killing all the
Mm.
people that are on it.
They're not going to
That's
live
kind of
after
what
that,
that
really.
means. Yeah. So that land, it's a bit like the picture in Isaiah 34, where 34:10, where
Mm,
you've got this ever, this smoke of it that is rising
yeah,
forever. It pictures this idea of this land that is totally hostile to life. And traditionalists would go, but look, the land is still there. And you go, well, where are the people? Where are the Edomites? It's been
yeah,
destroyed. The land
yeah.
is desolated in such a way where no
Mm.
life is. The people have
And
gone.
even the
This
restoration of
isn't,
that land isn't people suddenly living again, or like a universalist will argue that about Sodom and Gomorrah's restoration, or supposed like the language of restoration in Ezekiel, I think it is. They will say, "Oh, look, see, it's restored." And it's like, well, no, that's not the same
yeah,
people that were judged. These are new people being given the
yeah,
land. They've
yeah,
inherited the
yeah,
land from
yeah,
those who were wicked. This isn't a sudden extra
yeah,
resurrection of people just for the universalist argument.
yeah, yeah. There, I know. Um, yeah, well, the idea that I wanted to get at there was just, yeah, strictly speaking, the destruction is the
Mm,
land is destroyed, not the people as such. But part of destroying the land involves killing the people. That's what they're
yeah.
trying to say. You look at a movie where some raiders have come in and they've burned a village down, and you look and the village is destroyed. Yeah, no, without a shadow of a doubt that those people
Yeah.
in there are dead. Like that's the point of showing the imagery of a burning
Mm,
village. Yeah, they've gone in and destroyed the land. What have they done to the people?
yeah.
Well, they're gone. They're done for. I mean, that's what the Bible's
Hmm.
getting at. Um, so I don't know. I don't know how far that takes them.
But it doesn't take them very far. It really doesn't. And I think if you, yeah, and I think that's why it's important to do this, is not just to state it's a category error, but even if it wasn't a category error, it still emphasizes God's judgment leads to the death of the wicked. They will not have
Yeah,
the land that they're on.
yeah. Well, how is the Bible using
Hmm.
that imagery? So it's using the desolation of the land as part of its a judgment statement that's talking about the
Mm.
end of the wicked, the death. They're slain. They're all lying at the foot of their idols, like they're dead. Um, all right. The next one is this. This here is a head scratcher. Why on earth any traditionist would cite the flood? The land is destroyed. The world they've
Mm.
got, I think, Mu. There's a couple of, I think, three separate authors in that book. What's it called? Oh God, there was that big response
Hell
to.
under fire, is that the one?
Um, yeah,
Mm.
Hell Under Fire. That's it. It's three separate. They just virtually just restate the same argument. They restate
Hmm.
Carson's argument. I think they add this. Moo adds this idea of the world um, being destroyed, and then he's like, "But look, it's not gone out of existence." But when you dig down into it, the world is the Bible. When it talks about the world, it's talking about
Hmm.
the people. It's not talking about this cosmos, this land, this
Mm.
globe that we live on. Um, so uh, I'll pull up, or I'll just read out 2 Peter 3:5-6, which is what Moo cites. For they deliberately overtook this fact that the heavens existed long ago and the earth was formed out of water and through water by the word of God. And that by the means of these, the world, so that by means of the water, the world that then existed was uh, deluged and with water and perished. So the world, it's again, you've got this New Testament author taking an Old Testament picture of destruction and saying and using that picture as um, to
Hmm.
say something in his own theology. Um, when I went back to the very first mention of the flood, so that's in Genesis 9:11, I found something very interesting, which is the Old Testament background for 2 Peter. I mean, nobody can doubt that. So this is 9:11. I will establish, this is after the flood, right, had happened. People had died. It's very evident in the story that that's what happens to everyone except those on the ark. And God says, I'll establish my covenant with you. that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the
Hmm.
earth. Now, notice that language of cut off. Where have you seen that before?
Oh, all the way through Psalm 37. There we go.
Ah, yeah. So cut off isn't just, and it could just be like in the Torah, which we might say the Pentateuch, but the Torah, where the law is established, where you're just talking about a context of the covenant that you're separated from God. It could just sometimes be as
Mm.
narrow as that, but very, very often it has that idea, but also the idea that the being cut off means you're killed. So Gordon Wenham, I looked him up because I trust him as an Old Testament exegete. He said something. He indicated that cut off is very often um, uh, it's a frequent threat in the law and against sin and indicating a sudden mysterious
Hmm.
death. That's really often what it
Right.
means. And it's very clearly that's what it means when we talk about the flood. If you're cut off, it means you're dead. You're suddenly killed. It's not a mysterious death,
Hmm.
but it's because there's no mystery as to what's killing them. If you're drowned, if a big flood comes along or you get a flash flood and you're swept away and you're killed, there's no doubt about what's happening to you. But notice how that in Genesis 9:11, he's talking about the flesh being cut off by the waters of the flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. So destroying earth has to do with killing the occupants on it. It's not as if you can just talk about the destruction of the land or the earth without talking about the death of those that live on it.
Mm. Yeah. I'm there. I'm there. Fairly conclusive.
Does that not just completely take the air out of that argument, or
Yeah.
that's not? I just don't. I can't see how that's a like what they want to say is, oh, look, the Earth continues to exist, and even though the word destroy,
Hmm.
yeah, but the part of the the point of emphasizing the Earth is destroyed that way is to say people who lived on
Mm.
it died. So that's not really a great example of of the Bible talking about people living in a
Hmm.
state of ruin.
Well, that's exactly it. So on
Yeah.
on Twitter, I've just been posting verses that
Yep.
single verses that just emphasize this point that throughout the Old Testament, reading the Old Testament, you can see God's judgment quite clearly as no future, an end, ash, corpse, all of it.
Yep.
Over and over again, every example is about death. It's about an end to the wicked. That the people of God will be spared. They will be the remnant. Uh, they will be where God dwells, and God won't
Yep.
dwell with the wicked. The land where God dwells will be cleaned of any
Yep.
stain, any mark, any sin. So over and over and over again, you have this throughout the Old Testament. So anytime anyone with eternal conscious torment as the view that they hold, they have to twist and bend each example, or just have a really cursory look. Like the this defense of this non-existence argument is weak, and then to actually use the flood as an
Mm.
example of, look, there's torment. I don't see it, and it just, yeah.
Well, yeah, it's like taking it out of context. Oh,
Mm.
it is taking those examples out of their context and just
Mhm.
isolating that one little bit that you wanted to
Yep.
emphasize and go, look, this is what the Bible talks about. When in fact the Bible itself is using um, that particular image to express something quite different to what the traditionalist was trying
Mhm.
to say in the
Yep.
first place. So, like, if this is the problem, and this is what got me, well, went a long way to convince me that I couldn't defend the traditionalist exegesis, was that there's this what's called pearl stringing in rabbinic or first century around that time for rabbinic exegesis. What they used to do, Paul does this in Romans, by the way, so it's not necessarily completely off
Mhm.
the reservation. We just have to realize what it is and not over. overemphasize it or use it ourselves, I think. But you take different texts from all over the scripture, and you look at the same word, and you take those texts out of their context, string them together based on the one word.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's why it's called a string pearl. And then you go, therefore, well, that's what traditionalists will do with text. They'll go, okay, there's unquenchable fire. So there's that kind of idea that they'll be always burning, and then there's weeping and gnashing. And so we'll just take that and put that together,
Yep.
unquenchable fire, and then we'll go eternal punishment. We'll just put that there with that, and you've got this string of, they're not even really
No, they're
connected
not.
words. They're not even the same words, but they're
Yeah.
actually the idea of a concept is stringing it together. But when you put them back in there, you pull the Lego apart and you put it back in its original, uh, context, you can see it. The
Yeah.
picture's quite different, than what they've been trying to create. I can't defend that. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
What can defend is when you take there's not wrong to do that, to bring those out of those contexts, put them together. But when you put them back, you still got to have that the the original picture has to make sense. And when you pull these out and put them together, they're still got to relate. It's still got to have that connection to the original picture in its own
Yeah.
context.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So you don't make a whole new beast or a whole new picture, a whole new thing altogether. And I think that's the problem that I'm having with traditionalism, traditionalist exegesis, and that's the problem that that's the reason why I look at their examples here and I go, oh, well, hang on. I'll go back and look at the context and oh, no, it really doesn't. I couldn't defend that. I couldn't, with a serious face, well, I couldn't feel right with myself quoting the flood as they do as an example of destruction that doesn't truly destroy people I couldn't use that to in the way that they do, because I know in its context, in its own context, it's used to talk about the death of the wicked, and it literally did. It's a story where they
Yep.
literally did die in
Yep.
the story. Um, I don't know how to reconcile that as an
No.
exegete.
And I don't think they do. I honestly don't think I know Chris Tate said it. I'm sure you've said it. I've said it. The traditional arguments for that sort of exegesis are weak, and actually are the arguments that are pushing people towards conditionalism. I'm not sure this channel is pushing people to conditionalism faster than the traditionalist arguments are. I think there's a general
Yeah.
thirst for real
Yeah.
digging into the Bible, and I think that's why there seems to be an increase, at least from what I'm seeing, an increase of people moving out of fundamentalist, hyper-literalist readings of Scripture into being atheists, and they're often really frustrating atheists to engage with because they think they've been reading the Bible correctly for X amount of years. They're now an atheist. They still read it like that and try and go, this is what you mean. And no, that's not what the Bible means. It's not that pole stringing. It's not that idea of eternal punishment. And so when we're doing this, that's the whole heart of this really extended look at Matthew. And for some people, it's a lot of hours, a lot of mileage to work through. But actually, I'm finding it beneficial, and I hope those who come across it and go through it really find it helpful. That in the context of Jesus' teaching, the whole sermon, there is no room for eternal torment. In the whole context of Matthew's view of apolomai, Matthew's view of death, Matthew's view of what chaff looks like, what the wind does to chaff, all of that. It's not even about our modern idea of existence. We don't even need that. What does Matthew say? Well, he says there'll be like chaff in the wind. Well, I can just use that language. As a traditionalist, those who watch this, if they watch it as a traditionalist, they have to explain to me why that image means anything other than an inanimate object. You become, under God's judgment, an inanimate object that just goes off in the wind. There will be no more. So I'm good with it. There we go.
Sure.
So
you're breaking up for me.
Yeah.
I just wanted to just quickly address the lost coin and wasted ointment, because I know that they'll look at that. And even if we had those, we couldn't explain a couple of examples. I don't think that's determinative of anything. I would just say that the majority of evidence really falls in our favor. But a lost coin, again, it's an inanimate object. Who cares? But there are people who describe, or the nation of Israel described as lost. And when you dig down into those texts, the idea is that they're lost, and that's associated with them being destroyed anyway, and they're gone. So apart from, being lost or being found again is about being brought into life. Wasted ointment is really just, I think, irrelevant, because not only because it's ointment, but if you throw it in the ground, it literally it soaks into the ground. It's gone. I mean, that's the idea of it being wasted, is that it is no more. It's not just that it's rendered into the state of uselessness, but that you can't find it anymore. So that's that idea. The reason that we might, as exegetes, we might translate apolumi in those cases as lost or wasted, is because of context. It's because you look at it and you go, within that context, it doesn't make sense to talk about loss of life like killing or slaying like it does in Matthew 10:28, because the coin and the ointment were never alive in the first place. So it doesn't mean much. What really struck me as an example, as a non-biblical example, other than say destroying the vacation, I mean, who cares? I mean, I concede that you can destroy a vacation and it still is going on, but it's not it's a horrible vacation. Okay, all right. So, cancer killing a patient.
Yeah, what's that about?
So Tim Barnett and Greg Google use this one. I kind of really just have to stop and go and ponder. I'm not sure why they think that was a good example. I think what they're trying to say is that parts of the flesh are killed off and destroyed, but the rest remains. Or I think they even connected that with, your flesh dies by cancer and your soul continues to exist in the afterlife or something like that.
I missed that one. Was that in their Hell Interrupted articles?
Oh, that's in their article, Hell Interrupted 2, which I've got 2 articles responding to.
I listened to your podcast, and I don't. Maybe it's just so bad. I don't need to defend that one.
Exactly, because when you look at it and you go, okay,
but the patient dies in the end, doesn't
it? The cancer, and it does. Cancer literally destroys parts of your body, leaves other bits intact. But it kills you.
Yeah, it doesn't last forever.
It's like, that's the point. It's a terminal condition. If you don't interact, if you don't. I'm in aged care. I do nurse a lot of people who have cancer, and I can tell you that if you got cancer, if you don't get rid of it and cure it, it'll kill you.
Yeah.
Most times. Yeah. I don't know how this is not a really good example for a conditionalist view of destruction. Your flesh is destroyed. You die. You're dead. Okay. So it's interesting to me. I don't want to come across as if I'm making fun of them, but I just find it very interesting that people would think that that's a good example for the traditionalist view of destruction.
If anything, they've given us another another example.
I think it's actually a really good example. Yeah. The flesh is destroyed by cancer. The person dies. The flesh will rot away and be gone. Now, if Jesus happened to said cancer can rot away your body and kill you, but it can't do the same to the soul. But there is one in hell. There is one who can destroy your body and soul, like cancer in Gehenna. We'd go, okay.
Yeah. Job done. Yeah.
Yeah. I really struggle to see how that's a good example of the traditionalist view of destruction.
Agreed.
That's more of an aside.
Should we? Where are we up to? So if we go to the
I think
that conclusion.
Yep.
On this bit.
Yep.
Oh, sorry. You still there? Yep, cool.
I
I'm
am.
still there. So if we go to the conclusion on this bit, and then we'll sort of wrap up the last bit of the chapter. We're at the hour and a half mark. I know we've got to chop some bits out of
Yeah, I know.
the first 15 minutes or so, but just to keep it accessible and reach the next bit. So yeah, carry on.
You want me just to summarize
Yeah, do you,
what I just said before? Because the couple of ideas that I had in mind here, one was this assumption that from Carson that um, just because a life has to do with the quality of life as well as living forever, so also the death or destruction must have some kind of enduring quality. That's just not true. Psalm 37, it's just plainly not true. Then this idea that you can you know posit or point to destructions of things like tables and pieces of wood or the land, and that somehow tells you something about the destruction of sentient beings. It's also like untenable. Um, and most of the time, well, not always, but most of the time, you can actually dig into the biblical context and show how that actually is being used to communicate um, the idea that the people die, whether that's off this earth and from this earth or if it's part of their final fate. But also, we hadn't drawn on this and talked about this. But if you look at the breadth, where these examples come from, they come from all parts of the Bible. And so it's not just represented in key proof text, but it's represented. You've got something from the beginning of it's the proto history, the flood, and you've got something in Psalms, and you've got something from Ezekiel. This idea of destruction that's connected with the real death of the wicked is just throughout the Bible. That's biblical theology. When you can see that repeated in different ways, and it comes to the same conclusion. And where we get this idea, sometimes traditionalists will say, you point to Psalms 37, that's just about the earthly death. Well, I'm just going to go, hey, Jesus is using that to talk about, he's moving it on. He's talking about in this very sermon how he is the fulfillment of the law. He's not looking back and saying, and just talking about these earthly things. He's looking forward and what the kingdom of heaven is like. And he's using earthly images from Psalms 37 to help him describe that. So he's pulling that language through. So it relates very much to the debate over the final fate of the righteous and the
so I
unrighteous.
think that's really
That's what
yeah. I think
Jesus is
that
doing.
really helps. If we got just because there's some really important bits that emphasize what you've just said, just in chapter 7, further into chapter 7, that repetition of examples re-emphasize what Jesus has just said, and also points back to Matthew 3 where it talks about fire. So I'm just going to go on to the next bit of the chapter because I think it just proves your point.
Yeah.
So in Matthew 7:15, following on from talking about how and just just a bit on reading the Bible, try and imagine these verses aren't here and these headings aren't here. So this is a full flow of Jesus's teaching. So it goes straight from how narrow is the gate and difficult the way that leads to life, and there are few who find it. Watch out for false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are voracious wolves. You will recognize them by their fruit, their actions. Grapes are not gathered from thorns or figs from thistles, are they? In the same way, every good tree bears good fruit, but the bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree is not able to bear bad fruit, nor a bad tree to bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. So then you will recognize them by their fruit. There's two things that I noticed straight away, and I'm sure you'll be able to point to some of the something else as well. But not only is it an aspect of God's grace that we're able to remove ourselves from being, well, we don't remove ourselves. We're not able to change ourselves from being bad trees to good trees. That is on God's grace that we are able to do that, and we have a part to play. I'm not going to get into Calvinism and nominalism, but we have a repentance in part of that. There is an aspect of God, the miraculous work of God's Spirit within us, that allows us to become good trees. But ultimately, those that don't, and their fruit is bad, they will both be cut down. So they've got the language of cut off and that kind of thing, and then thrown into the fire. And we know that this fire burns up, destroys, consumes,
Mm.
as from Matthew 3:12. There's no room for eternal, ongoing, conscious punishment for these trees, and
Mm.
and I don't think Matthew, again, this is where the traditionalist needs to argue their point better. If this is an image of fire that continues to consume, they need to explain why that would even be on Matthew's mind. With the argument around
Mm.
why on earth would image of fire, when fire and wood in every example in real life consumes to ash, why would Matthew be talking suddenly here about an ongoing fire for these trees? And if it's a
Mm.
category
Mm.
error of we're now comparing wood to human life, well, that's cut both ways, and it destroyed the previous argument for us as well. So, yeah.
No, I don't think so. I think there's a difference here where um, so what we were saying before with the category area, which if you just take them out of examples out of their own context, and you just say, look, look, that's the
Mhm.
destruction of a saucepan. That's a form of destroying that is ruination. And look, that can be what Matthew is talking about with
Mhm.
the person. And you go, well, okay, yeah, but that's a category error. Now, if they were to say, here's a Old Testament text that talks about the destruction of a saucepan, and it goes on in that context to use that as a metaphor, as a way of talking about the ongoing suffering of the people in, ongoing ruin of the people in
Mhm.
Gehenna, then we would go, ooh,
Mhm.
okay, forget about the category error. We have an explicit way that the Bible's using that to communicate one aspect about or something about the afterlife or the final fate of
Mhm.
people in Gehenna. That's not what happens. It goes the other way. When you look in the context, it's their end, not their ongoing existence in ruin. Here, you've actually got the idea of a double destruction going on. So if you cut a tree down, it's severed from its roots, it's going
Yep.
to die. If you really want to emphasize that something's going to die or be done away with, you emphasize that and it's going to be burned up and consumed. There's double destruction there. That's
Yep.
what I'm going to call it. And that's similar to the idea, or if it's not virtually the same idea as Matthew 3:10, which is one reason why I'm starting to include 3:10 in my thinking more broadly on Matthew's theology of judgment and destruction of the wicked, because I used to kind of just be a bit more reserved, because the question is, does it have to do with just Israel? But here he's using the same imagery anyway, more broadly. And I know it's got prophets here, but he's setting that, as you said, just after what he'd been talking about, the narrow way and wide way. And everybody I know, every Christian I know, wants to
Mhm.
use 13 and 14 and say, look, let's talk about, let's use that in the gospel message. This is
Mhm.
about us. This is about the world. It's not just
Yep.
about Israel.
Yep.
Yep. Here's an example. He's following on from that, but he's talking about false
Mhm.
prophets and what happens to them. Well, isn't that what he means by what that destruction is? It's the double destruction of a tree. It's like you cut it down, it's dead. You destroy it, it's gone. It's consumed by fire. It's done away
Yep.
with.
Yep. There will be no more.
How is that in any way a picture of ongoing
Mhm.
ruination?
Yeah.
An experience of being eternally destroyed or rendered unfit for your original purpose. It's complete
Yep.
destruction.
Done.
Death.
Death. Yeah. Absolutely. So shall we finish the chapter then, and then we'll
Yep.
wrap this
Yep.
up.
Yep.
So I'll
Go
I'll
on.
I'll read to the end. And then we'll
Right.
just make some concluding points, because I mean we could spend another hour on the rest of this chapter actually, but we won't.
You know I would if you let me.
And I could as well, but I will end up yeah, looking quite dazed if I do that.
Without sleep. Yeah.
So here we go. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven. Only the one who does the will of my Father in heaven. On that day, many will say to me, Lord, Lord, didn't we prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name and do many powerful deeds in your name? And I will declare to them, I never knew you. Go away from me, you lawbreakers. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does them is like a wise man who built his house on a rock. The rain fell, the flood came, and the winds beat against that house, but it did not collapse because its foundation had been laid on rock. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain fell, the flood came, and the winds beat against that house, and it collapsed. It was utterly destroyed. When Jesus finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed by his teaching because he taught them like one who had authority, not like their experts in the law. Which is an interesting comparison. So,
Right.
what are your thoughts? Summary of those.
Oh, I just noted a connection with Matthew 13. Right. So originally I had looked at at 21 to 23, and there's this idea that they've been cast out, right? And later on in Matthew 24, you have a lot of these kind of cast out, like you're you're thrown out of the feast and everything, and that forms the basis of a separationist. Loosely speaking, when I say separationist, there's going to be different variations of the separationist view of ECT. But they use that, they cite that a lot, and they'll go, like, I think Tony Costa was talking about spatial distancing. He uses that as the basis. Right here, I don't know if it's the first time Matthew has introduced it, but right here, in a context where he's talking about the destruction of those, these prophets, and we know the word destruction pretty much. We can argue this is what it means. It means the end. It's not this ongoing ruination of those who are destroyed. We've got this indication that being cast out has been destroyed. So if you're kicked out of the kingdom, that's bad in and of itself, and that's a very conditionalist. That fits very well with conditionalism. It's very conditionalist to say, hey, you're deprived of that life, so how is that not supporting our view anyway? But in this context where destruction, you're burned up, you're double destruct, you're killed, you're cut down like a tree and thrown in the fire, how can being kicked out of the kingdom not involve that? But I just noticed a connection with this last verse, 23, and then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. Go to Matthew 13:40 to 42. Just the weeds are gathered and burned with fire. The same idea as the tree with the prophets will be it'll be at the close of the age. So the Son of Man was out of his kingdom all causes of sin and all lawbreakers, and he'll burn them up in that fiery furnace.
There we go.
Whoa. Yep. So, okay. So what I want to say, I know we will all be going, oh, look, there's the destruction involved. Well, what I want to say that just because you'll later get passages where it just talks about them being thrown out of the kingdom does not mean that we should take outer darkness as some competing imagery that suddenly means they're not burned up. Jesus could very well just be emphasizing how people will be deprived of that of the right to participate in that life. That's very conditionalist. I mean, we don't need to say much more.
Nope.
If you don't have that life, you're dead.
Yep.
So it's inferred anyway. But we have a very clear example where it's connected to the real end of the wicked when they are kicked out of the kingdom of heaven.
That's huge. They will depart from. And that's seen all over the place with the banishment view of hell, that they will be kicked out. Look, they're still in existence. No. I think that's a solid one.
Well, if you take that as an isolation, and this is what they're going to do. They're going to take these out and they're going to say, okay, later on, 24, and I think we'll get to this when we discuss it.
Yep.
And I want us to remember this particular discussion when we do it, because the assumption is that if you're kicked out, you're going to keep living forever.
Mm.
From those, if you just took one of those other parables and you took them out and you go, look, they're in the outer darkness. Oh, they're out of darkness. They're living forever. As William Tanksley often says, well, outside the protected area in the darkness, you're liable to be torn apart
By
by,
wild wolves. Yep.
by wild
Yep.
beasts or killed by bandits anyway. It's not really it doesn't lend itself necessarily to ongoing
No.
survival.
At
But
all. Yeah.
but if you plug it back into Matthew's own theology and how he's developing it throughout, you just can't sustain
No.
that kind of exegesis, because we're going to remember this particular passage and go, well, when they were kicked out, look, these were these prophets that were actually told they were going to be doubly destroyed, cut off from their roots. They're cut down and they're thrown in the fire. That's a kind of destruction. And then you got Gehenna. He was talking about Gehenna. Look at all the imagery,
Mm-hmm.
and we go, all that's connected in one sermon. It's all the same message.
Yep.
Yeah, it doesn't suddenly transform into something else, and a competing imagery that suddenly means that cutting off doesn't mean kill, doesn't mean
Yep.
that burning up doesn't mean the burn up, that the flood doesn't,
Yeah.
so forth.
And all the way through. And I think that it just it wraps it all up in that final passage that everyone knows from Sunday school. The house on the rock stands,
Okay.
and so we've got this whole summary teaching of the Sermon on the Mount. If you listen to Jesus' words from chapter 5 to chapter 7, and you live on them, literally, you will have a strong foundation for your life that will bear you up when the storms come. So we apply it to the storms of life. But there's also the storm of judgment that comes. And the storms of life and storms of judgment, the waves, we're talking about the flood, we're talking about this language of symbolism that's all the way through chapters 5 to 7, is connected with the judgment of God, not just the really nice view of Sunday school where it's talking about when life gets hard, you'll have a foundation for your life, which is kind of true, but this is actually when you face God, you have a foundation for your life that doesn't get consumed. And we see that the foundations of being of life in Corinthians and the New Testament throughout. And we have this theme here that we build our life on Christ. We will not collapse when the wrath comes, when the judgment comes, which sounds extreme, but that's what has to happen for new creation to be removed of all evil, and how we are made to live in the presence of a perfect God. Our imperfections must be destroyed, and we start by trusting in Christ. So that's my summary. I'm realizing we're at an hour 45, and
Right.
any concluding thoughts on those?
Yeah. Well, I'll be quick because again, it's a conditional statement. So it's like this idea that the house that with firm foundation, like that's illustrating an enduring life. You're going to last through this disaster, but that's contingent on knowing Christ. So conditional immortality. So I know one friend of ours in Rethinking Hell wanted us to get into this idea of knowing, and I want to dig into that a bit more. But if you notice that back in, earlier in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus was positioning himself as the fulfillment of the law. So knowing him is putting you right with God. It's putting you right on the right side of the ledge of the law, all that stuff.
Yeah.
So again, it's bringing a lot of that covenantal stuff through, the Old Testament stuff, but then tying it together. And then this idea of a house being destroyed by a flood, how can anybody not think of that as judgment when you think of flood? Yeah. And then how anyone can think that the house is not completely destroyed. I know its bits remain, it's swept away, it might be in different parts of the river downstream. I have seen a destroyed house destroyed by a flood, and bits of it remain. There's a door floating down there, and there goes the bathtub. You do that to a human, they're dead. So we've discussed that. But again, that just breaks down Carson's whole assumption that just because one house represents ongoing abundant life doesn't mean the other one has to represent a kind of destruction where you're fully cognizant of being, perpetually ruined. No, no, no. That's not what it's getting at here.
Yep.
It's the idea that you're completely torn down and you're completely gone and taken away. And with the flood, you go back to Genesis 9:11, I think it was, and this whole idea of being cut off, and that's what is being evoked when Jesus is talking about the flood. It's being killed. You're that house. But I mean, when you talk about an analogy or a metaphor, it's that one point. You don't want to take everything about it. But this point of total destruction, I think, is what he's getting at here.
Yeah, definitely.
So that's a good summary, and it's closing off the Sermon on the Mount. And I think the whole way you've had this in building to, and he started with a citation of or allusion to Psalm 37, where you've got this contrast, very distinct contrast between abundant life and complete, destruction or death. He's done that all the way through, and now he's doing it again.
Yep.
It's very consistent.
Yep.
It's quite relevant and germane. We could keep saying the same thing, but that's what is the overwhelming message of what you get from Jesus when it comes to this kind of issue. I'm sure there's more you can unpack in different directions with other doctrines, but as far as I'm concerned, the Sermon on the Mount is a very, very strong conditionalist text.
Yeah. I think that point on verse 12 that a friend asked us to look into for fulfilling the law is quite interesting, a connection as to Jesus saying earlier already, I've not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. And so he's explaining that. And so it's so important to read the sermon together, all in one sitting. And if you haven't done that, go and do it at the nearest point in time, and you see that connection that Jesus fulfills the law and the prophets, but there's an aspect to our life now that can do the same through living on his words.
And after you've done that, go and read it again. Read Matthew from beginning to end, and read it again and again and again, and get all these connections. Because it's just not a collection of sayings.
No.
Like, even if Jesus did originally, this is Matthew's theology of judgment. It's theology of conditionalism, I think, now.
Yep.
But so look at it in its context. That's why I'm taking a lot of time now to unpack these issues, because later on it will help to see those connections.
I think, so important. Yeah. And I think it's probably time to sort of wrap that up. I think
I've finished. I don't have any more.
Yeah, no, that's great. I just want to thank you again for your time. I do appreciate how long it takes to get into the Bible. As I was telling you earlier, I was reading this book, Dallas Willard, Divine Conspiracy, and he's starting to emphasize the as he concludes his book, he's wrestling with the new creation. And he gets some things. He very much believes in the immortal soul and all that. And there's some bits that I'm like, oh, okay, that's. I don't see that here at all. But what he does get right is that there is a necessary, there's a need as Christians to have an intense time in the Bible. It's like he compares it to having a shower. You're not going to have a shower if you just have a little drip on your head. No matter how long you stand there, you're not going to have a shower. But actually, when you dig in and you spend this amount of time in the Bible, you are going to get soaked in it, and you're going to see it for all it's worth. And that's my hope in that, in the fact that it's recorded, that maybe someone will spend enough time in it to get soaked in it, and see not just God's judgment, which is throughout, but also what it means to stand up in God's judgment, to be able to stand in his presence, to be able to live a holy, righteous life, is to actually lose our to be humble, to be meek, to serve others, to be peacemakers, and that's all needed in this time more now than ever. So what a great way to finish. So let's wrap that up there. Thank you again, Darren, and we'll get a date in the calendar for chapter 8, 9, however many chapters, we'll figure it out as we get closer to the time.
Sure. Just before we leave, I just want to apologise earlier when I was stumbling a little bit. Sometimes the the brain says certain things and the mouth won't follow. So
It's all good. I,
I'll get it out
I'm sure
eventually.
there's certain parts that will probably be cut anyway, just because of the echo that we
Yeah,
had early on.
yeah,
So I'm still figuring. Maybe we'll just use Zoom. I don't know. We'll figure it out for next
yeah.
time. But
I'll download it.
cheers. Thanks so much, Darren,
Okay.
and thanks
Good.
everyone for watching. As I close off, just a reminder that this is the Hell Project. This is where I defend the view that without Jesus, we're all dead. And more so now than ever, I think Matthew agrees. And I don't think we've had to wrestle with Scripture at all, really, to get to that point where we can see that God's judgment will end up with a new creation where there'll be no more wickedness, no more death, no more mourning, no more pain. And that is good news. And if you'd like to know more, get in touch. If you want to know a bit more broader topics about what I view on the world and racism and morality and that sort of thing, sign up to or subscribe to Critical Witness, and keep an eye out for our finishing of the Matthew series over the course of the next months at this rate, which is great. But have a good one. Enjoy whatever time you've got left of the day. I'm off to bed, so we'll see you later. Bye.